During these terrible years, the dream of military men was to break through the enemy line by infantry assault, then roll up his flanks and disrupt his rearward communications by pouring cavalry and other reserves through the gap. This was never achieved. The effort to attain it led to one experiment after another. In order these were 1 bayonet assault, 2 preliminary artillery barrage, 3 use of poison gas, 4 use of the tank, and 5 use of infiltration. The last 4 of these innovations were devised alternately by the Allies and by the Central Powers. Bayonet assault was a failure by the end of 1914. It merely created mountains of dead and wounded without any real advance. Although some officers continued to believe that an assault would be successful if the morale of the attackers could be brought to a sufficiently high pitch to overcome machine gun fire. An artillery barrage as a necessary preliminary to infantry assault was used almost from the beginning. It was ineffectual. At first, no army had the necessary quantity of munitions. Some armies insisted on ordering shrapnel rather than high explosive shells for such barrages. This resulted in a violent controversy between Lloyd George and the generals, the former trying to persuade the latter that shrapnel was not effective against defensive forces in ground trenches. In time, it should have become clear that high explosive barrages were not effective either, although they were used in enormous quantities. They failed because 1. Earth and concrete fortifications provided sufficient protection to the defensive forces to allow them to use their own firepower against the infantry assault which followed the barrage, and 2. A barrage notified the defense where to expect the following infantry assault, so that the reserves could be brought up to strengthen that position, and 3. The doctrine of the continuous front made it impossible to penetrate the enemy positions on a wide enough front to break through. The efforts to do so, however, resulted in enormous casualties. At Verdun in 1916, the French lost 350,000 and the Germans 300,000. On the Eastern Front, the Russian general Alexei Brusilov lost 1,000,000 men in an indecisive attack through Galicia, June to August 1916. On the Somme in the same year, the British lost 410,000, the French lost 190,000, and the Germans lost 450,000, for a maximum gain of 7 miles on a front about 25 miles wide, July-November 1916. The following year the slaughter continued. At Chemin-des-Dames in April 1917, the French under a new commander, Robert Nivelle, fired 11 million shells in a 10-day barrage on a 30-mile front. The attack failed, suffering losses of 118,000 men in a brief period. Many corps mutinied, and large numbers of combatants were shot to enforce discipline. 23 civilian leaders were also executed. Nivelle was replaced by Pétain. Shortly afterward, at Passchendaele, Third Battle of Ypres, Haig used a barrage of 4.25 million shells, almost 5 tons for every yard of an 11-mile front, but lost 400,000 men in the ensuing assault, August-November 1917. The failure of the barrage made it necessary to devise new methods, but military men were reluctant to try any innovations. In April 1915 the Germans were forced by civilian pressure to use poison gas, as had been suggested by the famous chemist Fritz Haber. Accordingly, without any effort at concealment and with no plans to exploit a breakthrough if it came, they sent a wave of chlorine gas at the place where the French and British lines joined. The junction was wiped out, and a great gap was opened through the line. Although it was not closed for 5 weeks, nothing was done by the Germans to use it. The first use of gas by the Western powers, the British, in September 1915, was no more successful. At the terrible Battle of Passchendaele in July 1917, the Germans introduced mustard gas, a weapon which was copied by the British in July 1918. This was the most effective gas used in the war, but it served to strengthen the defense rather than the offense, and was especially valuable to the Germans in their retreat in the autumn of 1918, serving to slow up the pursuit and making difficult any really decisive blow against them. The tank as an offensive weapon, devised to overcome the defensive strength of machine gun fire, was invented by Ernest Swinton in 1915. Only his personal contacts with the members of the Committee of Imperial Defense succeeded in bringing his idea to some kind of realization. The suggestion was resisted by the generals. When continuous resistance proved impossible, the new weapon was misused. Orders for more were cancelled, and all military supporters of the new weapon were removed from responsible positions and replaced by men who were distrustful, or at least ignorant of the tanks. Swinton sent detailed instructions to headquarters, emphasizing that they must be used for the first time in large numbers in a surprise assault, without any preliminary artillery barrage, and with close support by infantry reserves. Instead, they were used quite incorrectly. While Swinton was still training crews for the first 150 tanks, 50 were taken to France. The commander who had been trained in their use was replaced by an inexperienced man, and a mere 18 were sent against the Germans. This occurred on September 15, 1916, in the waning stages of the Battle of the Somme. An unfavorable report on their performance was sent from General Headquarters to the War Office in London, and as a result, an order for manufacture of 1,000 more was cancelled without the knowledge of the Cabinet. This was overruled only by direct orders from Lloyd George. Only on November the 20th, 1917, were tanks used as Swinton had instructed. On that day, 385 tanks, supported by 6 infantry divisions, struck the Hindenburg line before Cambrai and burst through into open country. These forces were exhausted by a 5-mile gain and stopped. The gap in the German line was not utilized, for the only available reserves were 2 divisions of cavalry which were ineffective. Thus the opportunity was lost. Only in 1918 were mass tank attacks used with any success and in the fashion indicated by Swinton. The year 1917 was a bad one. The French and British suffered through their great disasters at Charmin-des-Dames and Passchendaele. Romania entered the war and was almost completely overrun, Bucharest being captured on December the 5th by the Germans. Russia suffered a double revolution and was obliged to surrender to Germany. The Italian front was completely shattered by a surprise attack at Caporetto, and only by a miracle was it re-established along the Piave, October-December 1917. The only bright spots in the year were the British conquests of Palestine and Mesopotamia, and the entrance into the war of the United States. But the former was not important, and the latter was a promise for the future, rather than a help to 1917. Nowhere, perhaps, is the unrealistic character of the thinking of most high military leaders of World War I revealed more clearly than in the British Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal Sir Douglas later Earl Haig, son of a Scottish distillery family. In June 1917, in spite of a decision of May 4th by the Inter-Allied Conference at Paris against any British offensive, and at a time when Russia and Serbia had been knocked out of the war, French military morale was shattered after the fiasco of the Nivelle offensive, and American help was almost a year in the future. Haig determined on a major offensive against the Germans to win the war. He ignored all discouraging information from his intelligence, wiped from the record the known figures about German reserves, and deceived the cabinet, both in respect to the situation and to his own plans. Throughout the discussion, the civilian political leaders, who were almost universally despised as ignorant amateurs by the military men, were proved more correct in their judgments and expectations. Haig obtained permission for his Passchendaele offensive only because General, later Field Marshal and Baronet, William Robertson, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, covered up Haig's falsifications about German reserves, and because First Sea Lord Admiral John Jellicoe told the cabinet that unless Haig could capture a submarine basis on the Belgian coast, an utterly impossible objective, he considered it improbable that we could go on with the war next year for lack of shipping. On this basis, Haig won approval for a step-by-step offensive not involving heavy losses. He was so optimistic that he told his generals that opportunities for the employment of cavalry in masses are likely to offer. The offensive opened on July the 31st, developed into the most horrible struggle of the war, fought week after week in a sea of mud, with casualties mounting to 400,000 men after 3 months. In October, when the situation had been hopeless for weeks, Haig still insisted that the Germans were at the point of collapse, that their casualties were double the British, they were considerably less than the British, and that the breakdown of the Germans and the opportunity for the tanks and cavalry to rush through them might come at any moment. One of the chief reasons for the failure of these offensives was the doctrine of the continuous front, which led commanders to hold back their offensives where resistance was weak, and to throw their reserves against the enemy's strong points. This doctrine was completely reversed by Ludendorff in the spring of 1918, in a new tactic known as infiltration. By this method, advance was to be made around strong points by penetrating as quickly as possible and with maximum strength through weak resistance. Leaving the centers of strong resistance surrounded and isolated for later attention. Although Ludendorff did not carry out this plan with sufficient conviction to give it full success, he did achieve amazing results. The great losses by the British and French in 1917, added to the increase in German strength from forces arriving from the defunct Russian and Romanian fronts, made it possible for Ludendorff to strike a series of sledgehammer blows along the Western Front between Douai and Verdun in March and April 1918. Finally, on May 27th, after a brief but overwhelming bombardment, the German flood burst over Chemin-des-Dames, poured across the Aisne, and moved relentlessly toward Paris. By May the 30th it was on the Marne, 37 miles from the capital. There, in the Second Battle of the Marne, were reenacted the events of September 1914. On June the 4th, the German advance was stopped temporarily by the 2nd American Division at Château-Thierry. In the next 6 weeks, a series of counterattacks, aided by 9 American divisions, were made on the northern flank of the German penetration. The Germans fell back behind the Vesle River, militarily intact, but so ravaged by influenza that many companies had only 30 men. The Crown Prince demanded that the war be ended. Before this could be done, on August 8, 1918, the Black Day of the German Army, as Ludendorff called it, the British broke the German line at Amiens by a sudden assault with 456 tanks, supported by 13 infantry and 3 cavalry divisions. When the Germans rushed up 18 reserve divisions to support the 6 which were attacked, the Allied powers repeated their assault at Saint-Quentin, August the 31st, and in Flanders, September the 2nd. A German Crown Council meeting at Spa decided that victory was no longer possible, but neither civil government nor army leaders would assume the responsibility for opening negotiations for peace. The story of these negotiations will be examined in a moment, as the last of a long series of diplomatic conversations which continued throughout the war. Looking back on the military history of the First World War, it is clear that the whole war was a siege operation against Germany. Once the original German onslaught was stopped on the Marne, victory for Germany became impossible, because she could not resume her advance. On the other hand, the Entente powers could not eject the German spearhead from French soil, although they sacrificed millions of men and billions of dollars in the effort to do so. Any effort to break in on Germany from some other front was regarded as futile, and was made difficult by the continuing German pressure in France. Accordingly, all these sporadic attacks were made on the Italian front, in the Arab areas of the Ottoman Empire, and on the Dardanelles directly in 1915, against Bulgaria through Saloniki in 1915 to 1918, and along the whole Russian front. Both sides continued to regard northeastern France as the vital area, and in that area clearly no decision could be reached. To weaken Germany, the Entente powers began a blockade of the Central powers, controlling the sea directly, in spite of the indecisive German naval challenge at Jutland in 1916, and limiting the imports of neutrals near Germany like the Netherlands. To resist this blockade, Germany used a four-pronged instrument. On the home front, every effort was made to control economic life so that all goods would be used in the most effective fashion possible, and so that food, leather, and other necessities would be distributed fairly to all. The success of this struggle on the home front was due to the ability of 2 German Jews. Haber, the chemist, devised a method for extracting nitrogen from the air, and thus obtained an adequate supply of the most necessary constituent of all fertilizers and all explosives. Before 1914, the chief source of nitrogen had been in the guano deposits of Chile, and but for Haber, the British blockade would have compelled a German defeat in 1915 from lack of nitrates. Walter Rathenauer, director of the German Electric Company and of some 6 other enterprises, organized the German economic system in a mobilization which made it possible for Germany to fight on with slowly dwindling resources. On the military side, Germany made a threefold reply to the British blockade. It tried to open the blockade by defeating its enemies to the south and east, Russia, Romania, and Italy. In 1917 this effort was largely successful, but it was too late. Simultaneously, Germany tried to wear down her Western foes by a policy of attrition in the trenches and to force Britain out of the war by a retaliatory submarine blockade directed at British shipping. The submarine attack, as a new method of naval warfare, was applied with hesitation and ineffectiveness until 1917. Then it was applied with such ruthless efficiency that almost 1 million tons of shipping was sunk in the month of April 1917, and Britain was driven within 3 weeks of exhaustion of her food supply. This danger of a British defeat, dressed in the propaganda clothing of moral outrage at the iniquity of submarine attacks, brought the United States into the war on the side of the Entente in that critical month of April 1917. In the meantime, the German policy of military attrition on the Western Front worked well until 1918. By January of that year, Germany had been losing men at about half her rate of replacement, and at about half the rate at which she was inflicting losses on the Entente powers. Thus the period 1914 to 1918 saw a race between the economic attrition of Germany by the blockade and the personal attrition of the Entente by military action. This race was never settled on its merits because 3 new factors entered the picture in 1917. These were the German counter-blockade by submarines in Britain, the increase in German manpower in the West resulting from her victory in the East, and the arrival on the Western Front of new American forces. The first 2 of these factors were overbalanced in the period March-September 1918 by the third. By August of 1918, Germany had given her best, and it had not been adequate. The blockade and the rising tide of American manpower gave the German leaders the choice of surrender or complete economic and social upheaval. Without exception, led by the Junker military commanders, they chose surrender.